from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. We're going to talk about strategic risk, but I'm going to talk about some things that are, as I always do, things are in the news, things are being discussed. But one of the things I want to talk about, which may sound strange with everything else going on, is I want to talk about this designation of the Mexican drug cartels as terrorist groups. This has gotten a lot of discussion on the air. All the different major news outlets have been discussing this. Certainly, lawyers have been discussing this extensively. What does it mean? What can this do? And of course, part of the discussion during the campaign season was, and this was not just coming from the Trump campaign, but also from others, was the idea, I should say others, meaning others in Congress, I should say, that we're talking about potential military strikes on the drug cartels in Mexico or wherever they are. And this is not a new concept. As a matter of fact, I seem to recall that Tom Clancy wrote about this, and it may have been an inclusive part of a plot line or two in some of his Jack Ryan stuff. The idea of the president gets angry and the U.S. decides that they're going to strike out the cartels. Not new. And frankly, the U.S. has been involved in Latin America for quite some time. When I say Latin America, I mean from Mexico on all the way down south through South America, that involved with military operations down there going against the drug cartels in a variety of different ways. So it's not a new concept to do that. However, we have not been doing it to certainly not overtly, although I'm not saying that the operations themselves would be overt. I think we'd think operationally, tactically, they'd be covert, although strategically, if we're saying we're doing it, kind of lets the cat out of the bag. What I'm saying is that we haven't been doing it quite this way. We have always tried to coordinate with the host nations. We've certainly, anything we've done with Mexico, we have always coordinated closely with Mexico. And yes, it has been at times a very difficult relationship, but I'm going to talk about what this is. Now, does it really change legally how we view the drug cartels? Well, in some ways, you could say yes, because we're calling them terrorist groups. So you think, okay, this opens up all the stuff that we did with the global war on terrorism, the same sort of tools that we used in certainly Iraq, Afghanistan. You certainly remember the taking out bin Laden in Pakistan and a variety of other places around the world. So the first thought is, oh, okay, so we're talking about something like that. Well, I've seen no indications that we are talking about something quite like that. But what I am seeing is that this is certainly another ratchet on the way that we hold the drug cartels. It also deals with something that doesn't get much press in the U.S., but does get a lot of press down in Mexico, which is this hyper-militarization of the cartels, using armored vehicles, using landmines, using drones to include explosive drones, attack drones, kamikaze drones, all sorts of stuff that with everything else going on in the world doesn't usually make the top headlines. But this is part of what's going on with the cartels, is that they have become a much bigger paramilitary or military style threat, not just on the border, but throughout Mexico. That's one of the things that this is kind of recognizing, if you will, is the militarization or paramilitarization of the cartels well beyond what they were before. The problem that the U.S. has always faced working with Mexican authorities in going after drug trafficking groups, going after the cartels, is the incredible influence, the connectivity, if you will, of these criminal cartels to the establishment throughout Mexico. This is the establishment of business, politics, the military, law enforcement, security forces, basically this pervasive influence in all of Mexico, or all of Mexican society, if you will, and their political economy. That makes it very difficult to do stuff. I mean, certainly, it's not just, there's enough certainly verified facts, if you will, of the cartels having influence at the highest levels of Mexican political order. That being at the highest levels, I'm talking about the president's office in Mexico. And certainly, as we've seen, Some of the top military leadership has been linked directly to the cartels. So that has been an ongoing problem with how to deal with Mexico and going after the cartels, is because literally the top officials you're working with on counter drug, who are nodding their heads and saying, yes, we have to do something about drugs, are on the side taking money from the cartels and sharing with them whatever they learn from the United States. That's a big problem. The other issue is the cartels are so big in terms of their economic influence, it distorts business, not just politics, but distorts business throughout Mexico. Mexico's gross domestic product is somewhere around 1.8 trillion. Annual income is somewhere around $500 billion. So you're talking about literally an income that's about a third, representing about a third of Mexico's GDP. And oh, by the way, that income doesn't get reflected in those official GDP figures, but it gives you an idea of how powerful the cartel's economic weight is. And by the way, they're a criminal organization, and they do everything that criminal organizations tend to do. So they will do all sorts of stuff, like they will go out there and tell them, hey, you have to buy your widgets for production from these guys. You have to use this trucking firm. You have to do this, just like any other group that where there's basically a criminal organization where there's influence schemes, all sorts of criminal activity that goes well beyond, people paying protection or whatever. That happens in Mexico as well, along with all the drug trafficking, human trafficking. And what that means is that it distorts the business or economic model of everything throughout Mexican society. In fact, one of the things that's kind of interesting is, drugs are by far, I believe, the largest component. I think they surpassed certainly gas and oil a long time ago, but they're this huge economic driver in Mexican society or Mexican economy. One of the other big things, though, is tourism is always like at the very top. But if you really want to go back into the tourism side, a lot of the money that paid for building these fabulous resorts in Cancun and elsewhere, if you want to go back historically, a lot of that cash that was being laundered, so to speak, was drug money that was being laundered in the tourism industry. One of the great ironies, when all sorts of homicides were happening in and around these big tourist places, such as Cancun, with the bodies showing up all around Cancun from obvious cartel slayings, that it was causing huge problems with tourism. And it was somewhat ironic that that what they were doing on the drug side, the violence associated with the drug trade, which paid for, in many ways, subsidized or underwrote building the resorts, was now taking away from the tourism revenue that was coming into the resorts. So it's a big problem. Now, one of the other issues I'd be remiss if I didn't bring out is the insatiable U.S. demand for drugs. As Mexico and other countries around the world, but certainly Mexico, Colombia, and others have said, look, there wouldn't be this massive drug trade if there wasn't this massive demand for drugs from the United States. And that is simply true. And with the U.S. putting so much effort on stopping the flow of drugs, stopping the trafficking of drugs, and not, by many measures, not doing enough to curtail the demand side of drugs, what happens is it increases, because in many cases this is a enforcement means relying on the actual or potential use of kinetic force to enforce this policy, if you will. Well, what that's done is it's raised the risk of dealing with drugs with an increased amount of risk. In this illicit trade, you're seeing more and more violence associated with it. And so in many cases, the violence associated with it is not a direct, certainly an indirect result of the enforcement activities, however that's being done, to stop the drugs coming in. And so I'm not the first person to say that. I don't think this is a wild thing to show that linkage, but that's been talked about for many, many years. All right. And the idea of going after kingpins, the top drug cartel leaders, always sounds great. It certainly makes sense and, can turn into a wonderful movie at some point, if you will. But the reality is you take out the leader of a cartel, they've got somebody else waiting in the wings. And these cartels are massive enterprises. They don't stop just because the nominal CEO was removed, for however that happens, whether through assassination or through arrest and conviction or whatever. The business keeps going on because the demand side is still there. And as long as there's huge demand, they will find a way to provide the products that they want. So what would strikes do? If we were to do military strikes, autonomous military strikes in Mexico, what do they do? Well, the short-term gain, what it would show, I guess we could hit some kingpin homes, places where they do business. Of course, the collateral damage will be a big issue, as we see it in military actions around the world. Certainly we saw in Gaza, but you can pick a number of other countries. These are rarely clean actions. You don't take out only bad guys. You usually have some degree of collateral damage. In many cases, innocent women and children who happen to be there. So using military strikes, airstrikes like that in such a way is difficult. Even special operations using ground forces, there is a certain operational risk of incurring a lot of collateral damage, taking out non-combatants, if you will, taking out innocent, relatively innocent women and certainly children, by definition, innocent children. So that could happen. And so there could be an exercise and you get a lot of, successful battles fought, but it's doing nothing to win the war. It does kind of remind me of what happened with Blackjack Pershing, General Blackjack Pershing, prior to World War I, where, after the attack by Pancho Villa's forces in Columbus, New Mexico, the U.S. Army went down there chasing Pancho Villa's forces all over Mexico, all over northern Mexico, definitely. And after doing that for a very long period of time, they never could catch him. They eventually came back. They wore out all the planes. They wore out a ton of vehicles. They wore out the troops, certainly. And Pancho Villa basically elevated in status politically to the point where he eventually became the president of Mexico. So you can have some truly unintended consequences from trying to do something like that. The increased enforcement efforts in the past in Mexico, however they were done, did cause some very strange things. For example, the Gulf Cartel had hired essentially almost like a battalion, an airborne battalion of troops. And the Gulf Cartel had brought these folks in as enforcers, if you will, as this paramilitary enforcement tool. And this group is what eventually became Los Zetas. And Los Zetas, very military regimented style that they do stuff. Los Zetas essentially broke off and became their own drug cartel, very big in Texas at one point. And it was interesting. They also kind of twisted around some of the logic. I talked about the risk in the drug business driving the violence, but the violence was there to support the drug business. With Los Zetas at one point, for years, it looked like the drug business was there to support the violence. In other words, the drug business was subsidizing their paramilitary operations and their kinetic operations rather than the other way around. And it was a very strange sort of twist, and it gets into a lot of pseudo-religious stuff where basically there was a whole little branch of narco-trafficking, pseudo-Catholicism or something like that. Very, very strange stuff, sort of paganistic stuff if you really got into it. So anyway, very odd, very odd. Now, back in the 90s, one thing about the drug business, and we've said this many times, it's a business. It is not a crime of passion. If you're moving drugs, it's not because you passionately believe in drugs. It's because you passionately believe in making a lot of money. That's what it's about. And one of the things in the 90s when I was working this is we pushed a concept. We said, look, rather than this kingpin stuff, which was vogue, very politically popular, this was when the military intelligence was trying to improve our counter-drug enforcement efforts. I can't tell you that was really successful across the board. I think it was not a complete waste of time, but it really didn't do what certainly President Reagan hoped it would do, nor what President George Herbert Walker Bush hoped it would do. It kind of dithered throughout the 90s to the point that eventually the services pulled all their intelligence personnel back from working this mission. But one of the concepts out there was going after these cartels, these drug trafficking organizations as very large criminal enterprises and really getting into the enterprise side of it, looking at them in terms of assets, financing, how they're operating as a business entity. One of the acronyms we had was International Criminal Enterprise Research and Analysis. That was a term we used, and it certainly tied in with other things. For example, Financial Crime Enforcement Network, back at FinCEN, the famous FinCEN, back in Washington, D.C., and of course, and at that time, and I think this may have been part of what pushed back on it, the FinCENs were trying to create what they called high-intensity financial crimes areas, a program that, from what I can tell, just basically was a parade that went out there with a lot of notoriety and just completely fell apart. But that was the HIFCA program. And then, of course, things that have happened, like the Egmont Group, with the connectivity to financial intelligence units throughout a number of countries throughout the world. All of this was focused on going after this. Interestingly, some of the ideas in terms of international asset forfeiture, seizing bank accounts and other capital and things like that on a international collaborative effort, working with a variety of allied countries, basically trying to close off the space and time that these cartels can operate. Great idea. And it was actually employed not for going after criminal enterprises, unless you consider Russia a criminal enterprise, which is, one can make a strong argument there. This was used very extensively in going after Russian assets, Russian bank accounts, everything Russia had after it invaded Ukraine. Remember watching this at the time, I go, that's exactly what we talked about doing at that time, 25 years before. I said, this is exactly what we're talking about doing. And obviously, it's had a pretty big impact. And so that would be one I'd say they need to take a hard look at that. It works. Again, you take away the profit. You take away the net income, not all the income, but you're taking away the net income from the business. You're making it such that it's not really a profit-making business. You will decrease that business, but you go after it because every time they make money, you find some way to track it, and then you go out there, and everyone thinks it's all, cash. And for a long time, they thought it was, loads of cash sitting in walls and stuff. And yeah, there is some of that going on. I don't deny it. But in many cases, it's assets. They just buy stuff, ships, planes, property, real property, whatever it is. And if you can take that where that capital goes and seize it, eventually it's no longer a profit-making business. It's like dealing with drugs is like dealing with acid. If you try to do anything financially with it, it burns you. And so that would be the idea behind that. I just hope they go back and look at that. I think that'd be much better. All right. So that is talking about the drug trade. The other thing, too, is talking about FEMA. And there's so much that has to be done. One thing that happened after 9/11 was there was a real federalization of emergency management, emergency response, first responder efforts across the board. And interestingly, kind of like we're talking about the drug trade with all the pervasive funding, all the federal funding coming through Homeland Security channels, particularly like FEMA grants and stuff like that, was really distorting of what was going on. It was distorting what was being offered. And there were a lot of very, certainly in Washington, D.C., very popular programs. One of the things that FEMA loved was centers of excellence. And there would be this rapid competition amongst universities and institutes and everything, that everybody wanted to be a center of excellence and then be a recipient of all these federal grant funds, these FEMA grant funds that paid for the center of excellence. Well, these centers of excellence would be funded, so they would offer whatever they do free. Well, when you offer something free, even though it's not free to taxpayers, it costs a lot of money to taxpayers, but it was free in the system. What that tended to do was wash out. So you could have something that was 3 times or 5 times better at 1/3 or 1/5 the cost, but it could not compete against whatever was being done through the centers of excellence, because whatever was being done there was absolutely free. And free is a very tough thing to compete against. And so what it did was it basically eliminated price, if you will, as a consideration. And in some cases, certain like states, California comes immediately to mind. There were things that they were going to literally get rid of. I could think of one institute in particular that they were going to get rid of back in the early teens. Said it wasn't needed anymore. It used to teach things that weren't being offered anywhere. And it was basically covering stuff that was pretty much offered everywhere. But it was doing stuff at a price of 2 to 5 times greater than what the commercial alternatives were, the non-institute, non-state alternatives were. However, they kind of contorted their regulatory powers in order to wipe out competition, and they were successful. The results were pretty dramatic. You know, if you look at the LA fires, one could make a line back and say that's an indirect result of the, basically this dumbing down or this rush to mediocrity, if you will, in terms of emergency preparedness training and things like that. So, and certain things not getting out there, and it gets beyond that. If anyone's familiar with Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 502, which was a major effort by DHS to incorporate all hazards, all threats, intelligence production, intelligence capability, working with Emergency Operations Center, emergency preparedness, emergency planning, providing a high level of all threats, all hazards, intelligence support to state and local leaders. Well, that was killed. And that was killed in order to divert that money to pay for other things, usually things that had absolutely nothing to do with what that money was really intended to do. But it became incorporated within that distortion effect across the board. And then we pay for it. LA fires, we pay for it. Paradise Fire, we pay for it. Some of these big attacks that shoulda, woulda, could have been prevented, terrorist attacks or just mass violence, where after the attack took place, they go, oh my gosh, authorities knew about this, and they didn't take proper action. There were clear indications and warning that this was going to take place, and I could name a number of attacks where this is the case. This is that distortion, is that it basically took out best practices. It took out some of the most effective programs because of this economic distortion using FEMA funds across the board. So I don't know if we should eliminate FEMA, but definitely FEMA, and I think I found myself in the majority of Congress would agree with this, FEMA needs some truly significant reform. And by the way, FEMA, the other part of this, which ties to it, is you may have heard there was some action taken on some of the inspector generals. The inspector general's office of DHS knew about this problem and basically didn't look at it for years. And a couple of inspector generals rather famously, in fact, I think one was gone after illegally for criminal actions. And part of this is this problem with the oversight of the inspector general. There's a famous saying in Rome, in the Roman Empire, called "Who watches the watchers?" And the question was, who was watching the watchers? And, that's a big issue that needs to be addressed across the board. And I hope that it will get addressed. I hope that something will happen there where they look at that. So that's some of the FEMA stuff. I know even though this goes for a while and we do talk about these things, I do feel like at some point, even if I spend a half hour talking about it, I feel like I'm just talking on wave tops here with some of these issues. And I'm hoping that this move to take a hard look at what FEMA is doing will make a big difference. But I do hope that there is some collective action within the Department of Homeland Security, tying together the fiscal side, what are they paying for, with what outcomes are we getting. And that was one of the problems I saw with not just FEMA, but really DHS, was that for years you would find if you were out there doing stuff like Homeland Security training and there were issues that you wanted to address DHS, you couldn't figure out who to talk to short of the secretary themselves. The funding thing was controlled through a completely different directorate, if you will, completely different chain of command. If it was tied to anything dealing with intelligence, again, that was through a completely different chain of command. And because of the convoluted way they set it up, the training portion was through a different chain. So if you're looking at something like FEMA-funded Homeland Security training, you had 3 different divisions within DHS that you had to talk to, and all of them just were very good at saying one thing. No, you have to talk to those guys. You have to talk to the other people, not us. They're the ones that have to fix it. And so if somebody can get in there with real leadership, make these changes, start holding non-performers accountable, start putting some common sense in how this is all done, I think that'd make a big difference because, frankly, as someone who lives in Southern California, I don't want to see any more fires like this. And if you look at the LA fires, more and more is coming out about how much of this was avoidable, how many bad decisions were made prior to the fires that led to the lack of preparedness or the lack of readiness or resilience, if you will, to deal with these fires. And other problems like dealing with notification, which gets into dissemination of information. I don't know what you want to call that. It's a function within the broader area of what we call intelligence across the board, although sometimes people just are afraid to use that term, but that's really what it is. And not the first time we've seen it. We've seen it with Paradise. We've seen it with other fires. We've seen it with the mudslides up in Montecito. We've seen this across the board with natural disasters. And that goes to this distortion effect that FEMA has had in terms of funding, where a lot of really good best practices, a lot of the best initiatives, some of the best ideas were being forced out of the process because there was this kind of, going to the lowest common denominator thing that FEMA was pushing and the DHS was pushing. That's something that needs to be fixed. All right, that is enough. I feel like I just went on a bit of a rant there about a couple of big subjects. I have thrown out some ideas. I hope somebody out there is listening to them in terms of how we might start addressing these things. But this goes to the core of strategic risk assessment. This is the talk that we're having. And this is about reducing risk. It's about mitigating risk, if you will. It's about preemptive stuff. And by the way, in a lot of this stuff, so much more can be accomplished before the event takes place. The vast majority of it can be accomplished before the event takes place. But it takes a solid understanding, if you will, a solid assessment process, if you will, one that top decision makers can rely upon to make difficult decisions which goes to allocating budget and resources ahead of time before the disaster happens. When 75% of Pacific Palisades is on fire, a little late to get into the preparedness game, all right? You got to make those tough decisions beforehand. You have to make them when there isn't that overwhelming exigent situation underway. That's what I'd like to see FEMA do. And then going back to the drug trafficking cartels, do they conduct themselves as terrorist organizations? I think there's a lot of people who would nod their head and say, yes, they do. But if we're just going to go at them kinetically, I don't think we're going to have a whole lot more success than we've had in the past. And we could have second, third order effects that actually are very counterproductive. Really think we got to look at how do we address taking the profit, if you will, to make these drug trafficking, human trafficking, criminal enterprises, money-losing activities. That's, I think, what will make the biggest difference. That's, again, more complex. And if you're inclined to kick in doors and do things that are that look great in the movies and on TV, doing the stuff like what I just talked about may not look as exciting on camera, but it can achieve some amazing results. And I hope that we go that direction too. All right, that's enough. Great discussion. And I hope you'll tune in next week and we'll take this a little bit further. Obviously, things down in Washington, D.C. are changing very fast. And I'm just trying to keep up with them. And but we'll see, And even if there's stuff that you strongly disagree with, some of the changes coming out, I would say this. Somewhere in there's probably something that's not a bad idea. Reforming FEMA, pretty good idea. Dealing more effectively with the drug cartels, good idea, depending on how it's done. So with that said, thanks, and I will talk to you next week.